Okay, welcome everyone. We're here to talk about black holes in your IoT security and being able to stop those black holes. Really what we're focusing on today is beyond just IoT. It is really around industrial control systems, critical infrastructure, things like manufacturing, utilities, etc. Within the spectrum of IoT, we're not really covering too much around consumer-based devices, even though some of the information we're providing is very relevant to that particular market. But really at Lumeta, we're focused on some of these large organizations that are concerned about IoT security from that perspective. So today, my name is Sanjay Raja. I run marketing for Lumeta. In addition, Joe Sorial, who's VP of Products, will be presenting with me. Certainly a lot more of the technical details that we need to cover today. So with that, let's get started. So as part of the agenda, the first area we'll really talk about is the threat landscape around IoT and framing that for the type of environments I mentioned around industrial control systems as being one of the critical areas. When we look at attack trends that are targeting these type of systems, we can see in the last 12 months that IoT attacks are fairly regular. 67% of companies are suffering at least one form of attack. And what's not shown here is that there is a statistic available around 43% of companies actually suffer more than one attack in the last 12 months or have done so. When you look at the expectations around being able to prevent exploits from being successful within the next 2 years, there's not a lot of confidence in the marketplace that the current security solutions and ability to prevent these attacks exist today. And that's a great concern, especially as a security vendor. We want to be able to provide the right solutions and capabilities, but again, it's not quite there yet where people feel comfortable. When we look at a little bit more around the perceived versus actual reality around how threats are successful with these environments, it's interesting that traditional malware attacks that target regular operating systems and networks are actually the top cause of causing some of these incidents. And again, they are a concern. People seem to recognize that. But what's also interesting is that APTs are also actually the second highest in terms of being successful. There is a perception that third parties, suppliers, partners are introducing holes in environments, but really that's not as bad of a problem as suggested. What is a bigger problem is internally misconfigurations, things like firewalls or even routers and switches, and insider threats were pretty high up on the list as well. So really it's kind of in that order. Been surprised that that's actually a much bigger issue, but you can see there's a little bit of a delta between the perception and reality around what's causing the problems. Again, a lot of people think it's external damage or sabotage or third-party concerns, where really it's very much the traditional malware insider threats. Just to go over some of the high-profile attacks that have occurred across the year, WannaCry is, I'm sure people are tired of talking about it as the really first big ransomware that has been discussed at in a broad forum in the public. It actually hit Honda just a few weeks ago, so a month after the whole attack first started. And it actually impacted one of the plants in Japan where disrupted vehicle production. The understanding is it prevented about 1,000 cars from being delivered on time and kind of slowed their operations down. So again, it did have material impact there. When you look at utilities, pharmaceutical, and again, we got a little bit further with some of the point-of-sale systems and ATMs. Petya ransomware last week, and it's been called Petya, non-Petya. There's been a few other names there, but essentially that ransomware that occurred end of June, it actually hit the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, which I think I probably shared this with quite a few people. I didn't even know it was still open. I assumed it was closed down after the incident several years ago. They actually had to could not rely on their radiation monitoring systems and had to use manual methods to be able to check for radiation levels. The attack impacted, again, point-of-sale terminals and ATMs, as I mentioned, and also infected service for a Russian oil company called Rosneft. So it did definitely hit the Eastern Europe more severely, but we do see where it impacted other countries. The U.S. pharmaceutical company Merck, their manufacturing was hit as well. And then outside of that, the other area is healthcare. In the healthcare industry, there's a company called TrapX. They do deception technology. Their research team actually determined two major trends that occurred in 2016 across, that have kind of bled into 2017. which is medical devices have been susceptible to hijacking. And you can see the two names are MedJack and MedJack 2 were the names they were given to those type of attacks. But also, as you can see with the other two attacks there, ransomware has certainly grown significantly and hit all these industries. While ransomware is its own category, obviously it shares a lot of elements or common elements with traditional malware and advanced persistent threats. Even Petya, for example, even though it's called ransomware, it acted like traditional malware. Well, exfiltrated a lot of data around, user account information and even some proprietary information, confidential data across organizations. So that ransomware attack was also used for data exfiltration as well, not just, encrypting and locking down assets for ransom. When we look at the economic impact, from these attacks, specifically on industrial control systems, the average amount was approximately $350,000 US being reported by different businesses. And, that's across the entire set of companies that were hit. When you look at somewhat larger companies, again, over 500 employees, still not very large, the impact economically was about $500,000 in terms of loss. Again, pretty significant, especially when you're talking about a company that's, just a little over 500. I mean, again, they were pretty severely hit by some of these ransomware attacks, general attacks that were going on hitting industrial control systems. On the right side, we're talking specifically about ransomware. When we talk about ransomware, we're characterizing here, the amount of money that is demanded by ransomware perpetrators. But what's interesting are the demographics and actual execution of that by attackers, where a good chunk of that is against consumers, and usually it's in the range of $100 to $500 typically. That's to get your sensitive files or pictures, whatever it happens to be. Again, quite a big source of income from a percentage standpoint. When you look at the last several years too, there's been a lot of success against local governments, especially town governments, locking up town records. Law enforcement agencies, especially police agencies, have been hit quite heavily by locking computers through ransomware attacks. And we've seen, typically on average about $1,000, but as time has gone on, as they've been more successful, that number's creeped up. You can see it's gone up to about $5,000 in general is what hit that market. And then when you start to look at enterprises, we're seeing, 5,000 and above, all the way up to 150 and above. Company executives are paying. I mean, 70% of the time they give into the demands. And over 50% of the time, they're willing to pay even if it's over $10,000. You can see even 20% of the time they're willing to pay over 40. So again, pretty significant in terms of the money that can be made from some of these ransomware attacks that are occurring in enterprises, and certainly organizations that tend to be a little bit bigger in terms of industrial control systems, especially talking about manufacturing and healthcare. They are giving into this. Now, the good news, bad news is that almost all the time, the ransomware perpetrators are restoring the data. But the bad news is that the reason they're doing that is because they recognize if they get paid once, that they can come back several months later, a year later, not necessarily use the same attack, maybe use a different kind, and still be able to extract money. So it's in their best interest to restore the data and not, renege on the contract, so to speak, that they've engaged in. Because again, they know that they can be, that they've found a company that will pay, and they can go back and tap that well again. So again, good news, bad news there. When we look at, some of the priorities and some of the pain points that have occurred, and where really the focus areas is from an executive standpoint, Kaspersky Labs actually did a State of Industrial Cybersecurity report that came out in June, so fairly recent information. But just to pick out a few things there, the first is that definitely the skills gap in terms of being able to recruit and hire security professionals to be able to identify these attacks and prevent them from breaching or causing problems like ransomware. We can see that there's because of that skills gap that exists and the ability to not hire some of these folks as quickly as desired, the need for better security tools, especially around monitoring, analytics, and automation, being able to find those attacks in a better way and connect the dots between the attacks that are occurring by pulling in more contextual information as an example is something that can help bridge that gap. Until you can hire more people or make people get trained, whatever the case is that's a big area of focus. lot of the industrial control systems, manufacturing, et cetera, even healthcare, has leveraged a mix of old and new technology, older operating systems, some IP enabled, some not. But as people have layered or upgraded their devices to support these technologies, it's increased the complexity because now I have a mishmash of things that I need to monitor. Again, there's a wide variance in terms of OS or even performance characteristics. One area of concern is around the network because I have to change, make significant changes to the network in terms of adding these devices on, certainly bandwidth-wise, expansion-wise, things like that. So as I've increased complexity, there's, obviously security can sometimes suffer. It's much harder to visualize what's going on and be able to extract the right contextual data, especially to interpret from a security standpoint. So, solutions that can help interpret network information, combine that with security information, and really provide some sort of value to security teams can be helpful in kind of reducing that attack surface. And then lastly, solutions that really help that secure communications across, traditional IT environments that connect to the internet, that do a lot of your traditional heavy IT lifting versus your operational technologies, whether, again, it's medical devices or your manufacturing floor, or your water controls. Those types of things really used to have strong separation, and we need to be able to make sure that there are solutions that can secure the communications between and across these disparate environments now. So going to security challenge for IoT, and here I'll let Joe Sorrell take over and discuss some of these technical areas that we want to cover here today.
Thank you, Sanjay.
Let me shift it over to you.
Can you see my screen?
Yes, I can.
Okay, excellent, thanks. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the security challenges around IoT, why these particular segments of the network are really hard to protect and manage today, and then talk a little bit more about just some best practices for, given those challenges that we highlighted, some best practices for how we could do a better job of protecting our ICS environments. So in order to talk about the challenges, the first thing we really need to do is take a closer look at these devices and just what makes them so difficult to protect and manage. Really looking at the ICS and even legacy ICS devices, they're small devices, they're small footprint, they do a dedicated task. They might be a sensor or a valve or an actuator or something like that. So hardware resources like CPU and memory are really small. And that's done on purpose, really, because these guys are trying to optimize for low power consumption, for high availability, for low heat dissipation, things like that. So they basically make them as specialized as possible. And unfortunately, they really weren't built with security in mind. So they were never really thought of as, needing an agent that sits on them that does any monitoring or anything like that. So that really becomes a problem when you start trying to apply traditional IT best practices like endpoint solutions or EDR onto those small footprint devices. The other thing to consider there, and again, this is especially true for legacy devices, is that they were really meant to do more peer-to-peer type connections or point-to-point type connections. They were never really meant to be IP enabled. So some of the things that we see in a traditional IT network, for example, authentication enforcement and things like that, we don't really get to see any of those in any of the ICS devices, again, especially legacy ones that were never really meant to be IP connected. So right from the start, you really have a problem with trying to protect those devices at the endpoint level. So moving on to the OS, there hasn't really in the past, before ransomware and Stuxnet and all of those types of attacks, vendors didn't really patch their devices often enough, and some vendors, frankly, didn't patch at all. And that becomes a problem because vulnerabilities that are associated with the operating system end up being out there in the wild for months, if not years, before being addressed. And that leaves those types of devices obviously vulnerable. And a lot of the devices, again, especially the legacy ones, are probably no longer supported. So the expectation of getting OS level updates to mitigate risk, again, kind of goes out with that support. So really the next thing to do, and the movement has been to move over to more off-the-shelf type operating systems, whether it be Windows or Linux or something along those lines. But even though now you are getting access to patches and vulnerability updates, what you end up doing is actually bringing some of those mainstream vulnerabilities from your IT network. Now you're going to be exposed in your OT network. So while you may have the ability to patch, because now you're using more of an off-the-shelf operating system, you're also bringing some of the mainstream vulnerabilities along for the ride. And the complications really don't stop there, because if you take a look at some of these systems, be they power distribution or nuclear power plants or medical or oil and gas, for example, the expectation is that those systems are available 100% of the time. So really, there's really no opportunity to shut any of these systems down for patching or maintenance or upgrades or anything like that, and then bring them back up. And not to mention that, it's not exactly easy to shut down an electric grid, for example, do the upgrade and then just power right back up. These are large, complicated, complex systems that take some time to bring down and bring up again. So the challenge is not a trivial one, because even when when you do have the capability to patch and those systems are supported, you may not have the ability to do so because of the uptime requirements with those systems. And then finally, there's really no consensus on security in IoT or ICS. So there's no turnkey stack that's out there that says, yeah, implement this in your ICS network and you're good to go. And there is no framework either. So a lot of the times what we see is the IT security frameworks are applied to the OT network, and they don't generally translate for some of the reasons that I mentioned earlier. IT frameworks would say things like, put an endpoint agent, for example, for security and management, and we all know that that's obviously not the case in an ICS type environment. So because the endpoints are so varied, there's different flavors. There's some very legacy ones out there. They may or may not be patched on a regular basis. The consensus is now we have to shift away from the endpoint in terms of protection and focus on the network. So rolling things out like continuous network monitoring, figuring out segmentation, doing some behavioral analytics in that area, that becomes the focus for how to protect ICS environments. And that's what we're going to go through in the next few slides. So in terms of defense strategies, because the OT network is now connected to the IT network, or potentially could be connected to the IT network, there's more of a reason to have an extra set of vigilance and monitoring in those environments. So generally speaking, OT networks are very much locked down. Access is restricted. There's not a lot of machines going in and out of the network, be they virtual or mobile or laptops even. It's a fairly deterministic and static network. So what's there is always there and it's always running, and maintenance, upgrades, additions are very much scheduled in advance. So the idea there is much like we talk about real-time monitoring in an IT environment, we need to take that type of approach into the OT environment. So what you're really looking for there is be able to identify new network assets at the SOC as they join the network, and the OT network specifically, and making sure that there's a correct patch level. If there are endpoints that can run an agent, that there's an agent there, and be able to identify those in real time. So immediately, as soon as a machine joins the network, because of the nature of that network and it's the fact that it's locked down, we want to be able to flag that very, very quickly. And then by the same token, we also want to identify not just endpoints, but assets that may be changing the layer 3 topology. So these are devices, be they routers or some other type of device that is forwarding traffic, because now that's changing where things get routed, what's going in and out, and be mindful of that from within the network. And then obviously, as we're doing this in the IT network, we want to be able to monitor all of this stuff using a single pane of glass. So basically having all of that telemetry come back from all of our environments, be they IT or OT or cloud environments. It's important to do that monitoring across the board. So we've talked about the fact that OT networks need to be protected and that ingress or egress of data needs to be monitored very quickly. And this is where the importance of segmentation really comes in. So in this scenario, what I'm showing here is an environment where there's a SOC, there's an OT network, there's an IT network, and then there is the wild, wild west of the internet. And because of all of the challenges I talked about around protecting the OT environment, really what we have to do is take a network approach. And that is validate our segmentation in real time and make sure that there may be a couple of authorized network connections between my IT network, for example, an OT network for automation or monitoring or any other source of reason, but make sure that other segmentation policies are in place and are always valid. So there's never any rogue connection or firewall miscommunication that will allow somebody sitting on an unauthorized person sitting on the IT environment or IT network to be able to access the OT network. And then by the same token, we want to make sure that there's absolutely zero connection between the OT network and the internet, because obviously that would open you up to a variety of malicious attacks from outside parties into that OT network. So absolutely zero interaction between OT and the internet, and validating that in real time and being alerted about it if it is violated, so that remediative action can be taken immediately. And then finally, again, I talked about how the OT network is very deterministic in terms of devices going in and out. It's also very deterministic in terms of what kinds of communications are happening. So generally, it's controllers talking to actuators and things like that at the IP layer. So making sure that there aren't any questionable flows or questionable conversations that are happening from within the OT network is obviously exceedingly important. So the idea there is to correlate, to take a look at your net flow, correlate it against threat intelligence data, look at source and destination IP addresses, see if there's any correlation there. If there is, flag it, because chances are something in the OT is talking to a known bad actor, as indicated by threat intelligence. Another thing to correlate against is Tor flows. So make sure that there's nothing in my OT network that's communicating with Tor, for example, because as we know and as we've seen, Tor is recently being used for all kinds of nefarious activity. So making sure that there's none of that behavioral type stuff happening in the OT network becomes very, very important. So let me pause here. I'll send it back to Sanjay. Let him do a quick Lumeta overview, and then I'll go through a quick demo of Lumeta Spectre. Sanjay?
Thanks, Joe. Let me just quickly go. Yeah, so as Joe mentioned, let me do a quick overview of Lumeta Spectre, and that'll lead into Joe's demo. When we talk about Spectre, Spectre is the flagship product for Lumeta, and really what we provide is cyber situational awareness. And how we define that is we take the ability to see and understand the entire network infrastructure, including all the endpoints and extending into the cloud. And at Lumeta, we're able to find on average about 20% unknown, unmanaged, rogue or shadow IT infrastructure that's typically missed. In addition to the rest of your network, we can go as high as 40% in some cases, and many customers have gone that far in terms of finding some of their own devices. But we pair that with real-time monitoring, and this is especially critical that it's real-time due to the dynamic nature of networks and endpoints. As we have mobile devices, we have virtual machines that move around. There can be impacts and changes on the network itself based on this device movement, but also being able to see when new paths are being created or new segmentation policies are being implemented. Certainly if there's changes in router or switch configuration, we want to be able to detect that. And at Lumeta, we define real-time as being actually real-time. It's as it occurs, we see the change immediately. A lot of vendors talk about continuous monitoring or visibility within a short period of time, but that usually is done by polling or doing snapshots. It's usually not being done by actively listening for changes. And that's really the big difference between Lumeta and other companies, is that we actually do everything see everything as it occurs, which is important in the dynamic, threat landscape that we have, because attackers are very smart. They actually take advantage of polling intervals and, basically discrepancies in terms of being able to see events coming through, things like that, to be able to hide their activity. So even that short period allows an attacker to even do bursts of traffic externally. It just shows you why real time is critical. When we take that information and we marry it with external threat intelligence, that's a critical piece too, because now we're gathering all that real-time network context around endpoints and cloud infrastructure, but we're pairing that with security threat feeds and threat intelligence, giving us, a very, very different perspective on what's going on, and certainly helping security teams to be able to isolate threats and determine breaches before they can be successful. But what goes along with that too is that there's no security solution as an island by itself. Being able to work within a security stack means really being able to pull third-party data across different tools and share information as well to improve, the security information that's being analyzed and provided by some of the other tools that are out there, including Lumeta Spectre. This can only make security teams more effective in trying to find some of these complex threats that are running around your network. When we put that together, that's really what we call Lumeta Cyber Situational Awareness. That is represented by our flagship product, as I mentioned, Lumeta Spectre. As you can see here, we really look at 3 different areas in terms of what we bring to the table based on our capabilities. The first is, being able to certainly identify every single part of your network, including all the endpoints and cloud infrastructure. Even if they're very difficult to find or get to, or they may be isolated in different parts of your infrastructure itself and hard to find by normal means, we will be able to find it based on the mechanisms and different patent technologies that we use. That provides a level of analysis as we start to interrogate these devices and find them. But beyond that, we're also in real time monitoring these systems for changes, for unusual behaviors, for changes in traffic paths, for example, or flows. We're identifying all that stuff that's going on in the network from the endpoint through the network and across the cloud. Certainly, we can also detect when things go out to the internet as well. As part of that, when we marry the security intelligence and third-party metadata from security tools, we're able to add a layer of breach detection that doesn't exist today. We're really identifying unusual behaviors on the network, but certainly identifying how dynamic changes or paths being created could potentially be going to malware sites. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. The last part is, because of our understanding of the network and our ability to see everything that's going on within the network, we have the ability to do analytics and validation around network segmentation. So if I dive a little bit further into that, into specifics there, and here's some examples of what we can do. In the bottom part, as you see network infrastructure analysis, again, we can see things like core network changes. We can see things at the edge, which are really critical, especially when I have BYOD or mobile devices coming in and out of the network. I can see, again, virtual machine infrastructure changes, or even be able to peer into the cloud and be able to see certainly changes in the cloud, but also be able to find any sort of unknown, unmanaged, dynamic endpoints or just missing pieces that other tools aren't seeing or haven't been able to find. Now, this is critical, for example, in the WannaCry example that I used earlier, as there were a lot of companies and certainly a lot of the healthcare organizations like NHS were running vulnerability scanners to be able to make sure that they found any sort of endpoints or servers that were running older operating systems and, potentially determine if they were unpatched based on, CVEs out there. And one of the big problems that they did have is even when they had, Windows 10 systems, which were patchable, they missed a lot of them. They didn't see them out there. So they had that problem. They also missed a lot of older operating system-based medical devices and technologies that were out there too, because the vulnerability assessment tools didn't have them, right? As much as they claim to have visibility into endpoints and devices, they're not able to really fully find everything that's there. And this is where Lumeta could have stepped in to really give them the full asset list required to be able to do those vulnerability scans to see, hey, here are the systems that are unpatchable right now until Microsoft releases something because they're old. But here's showing the Windows 10 systems that we could patch that just came available, a month or two ago. And they could have done that, but again, a lot of these systems missed these endpoints. So again, that's a great example there. In terms of breach detection, the ability to understand that some of the devices and networks out there are rogue devices is critical. Being able to identify things like Tor traffic, where I'm hiding attack activity using that Tor traffic, and traditionally most enterprises don't want that type of traffic running on their network. But being able to identify those type of flows, being able to see paths that are being created for data exfiltration, and certainly being able to identify that this particular path being created is going to a known external malware site would be very useful too, especially when you talk about ransomware. Being able to see things like command and control activity as an example. And then lastly, around network segmentation, because I'm able to see all the existing paths that are there today, I can do some validation to make sure that they're working based, on security policy that I expect. I can detect whether firewalls are being misconfigured in terms of, being used as a way to isolate certain parts of the network. An example is I certainly don't want my engineering servers traditionally talk to my payroll servers. There really shouldn't be any reason for that to happen. So being able to make sure those are stay isolated and segmented is critical. Certainly between IT and OT infrastructure, this is a big topic where as I've introduced traditional IP networks in there and I've started to use general purpose operating systems, they are certainly more vulnerable from being attacked within the OT environment, but also across the IT environment where I may have gaps in terms of areas that traffic can bleed through or attackers can try to sneak through across the two different types of infrastructure. So segmentation is a big part of that, and being able to make sure that's operating properly is critical. So again, kind of a summary, when I look at what we can deliver for IoT and ICS environments, I mean, our ability to eliminate all the blind spots within your infrastructure is critical. And certainly we can do that within the IT environment. In the OT environment, anything that has been recently made IP enabled or uses a traditional IP, we can identify all those assets and devices and be able to provide at least knowledge of how they're interacting with the network, certainly within the OT environment, but also as they're managed and you have control traffic from the IT environment in some cases. Being able to apply security intelligence uniformly across the entire network is critical. Most security intelligence feeds usually operate at an endpoint level or look at some portion of the network like net flow information or packet data, but really to look at the network end to end from endpoint through the network and see how traffic is moving through the network to the cloud or to the external world and apply security intelligence to be able to identify, again, unusual behaviors or, attack patterns is something that's unusual. And again, being able to apply that everywhere is critical for security teams to really be able to identify the full scope of an attack in a lot of cases. And the last part is, being proactive using further and further segmentation is important, especially in IT and OT environments, as we've kind of broken down the traditional barriers between the two that existed based on, non-IP, very, very different control mechanisms for managing that technology versus IT systems. Those barriers have gone down. Segmentation is critical, and being able to optimize and validate and make sure that's working properly is important to be able to protect, protect certainly the systems there, but also ensure availability, make sure that the right people are getting to the right pieces within IT and OT environments while making sure that unauthorized users aren't able to access these systems. In terms of a typical example, when we look at an organization, whether it's a healthcare organization or manufacturing site, this is probably a typical example of a network where I'll have my physical network or basically my IT system, so to speak, that maybe I may have some level of private cloud there, maybe I may have some hosting services with Amazon. Certainly there can be VMware infrastructure out there. All these systems are part of my OT environment, and I want to be able to monitor and watch those carefully. But also, I want to be able to see traffic as it moves to the OT network, and you can see that there on the right side. But even with the OT network, I want to make sure that, or even cloud, either way, I want to be able to make sure that traffic isn't bleeding out of those networks into the internet. As an example, whether it's, again, ransomware trying to come inside, whether it's, data being exfiltrated, or just, even some sort of malware trying to take control over these systems. And again, that's where we can also be deployed to make sure that those environments are staying protected. As we talk about this, one of the critical things is that, I mentioned that sharing of third-party metadata is important for any sort of security practice to be effective. Again, no one solution is out there that can solve all your problems, and so it's very important that these work well in a security stack. We work with some of the top vendors out there. I use the example of WannaCry, where being able to do effective vulnerability assessments is important, and we have a huge number of customers that ask us to be able to work with vendors like Qualys or Red Seal because they don't feel like they're doing the full level of scanning and understanding all the systems out there and really finding all the vulnerabilities out there. And we can help provide them with data to make them more effective. So this is where, in this case, we're feeding another solution based on what we're seeing out there in the real-time identification of changes or new systems coming online to make sure that we are looking out for a new scan that should be set off will cover that asset that's newly been added or changed. And that's a great example of how fitting it within a security stack can make your overall security operations much more effective. Certainly the same thing exists with endpoints. The more that I can, protect my endpoints and install applications and software that are doing monitoring for, potential compromises in my endpoint infrastructure is critical. Being able to identify those as they come in and out of the network constantly is an important area. If you think about healthcare systems or even manufacturing, a lot of these systems will come online for a very brief period of time, maybe even burst a little bit of traffic and come back off based on what sort of operation they're doing. Being able to identify those as they join the network, as they start to do things is important, and being able to make sure that we monitor if they change or anything occurs that's unusual in those particular devices, especially if they get exploited somehow. When we talk about looking into the cloud or being able to really understand my network infrastructure as it changes, being able to understand things like DNS or being able to aggregate data from cloud environments becomes important. It's where we look at companies like Gigamon or Infoblox. And then lastly, around segmentation, today the primary American vendor we partner with is Cisco. Cisco is very concerned about being able to segment the network and unflatten it and implement policies that allow for optimized networks and segmentation. And we can work with them to be able to make sure that we're validating those environments to be optimized and also work as you would expect. That can help deploy segmentation more rapidly, but also, again, make sure it's working properly as well. So in terms of how Spectre can specifically help with IT and OT infrastructure, the ability for us to identify the endpoints, the devices that are starting to use, even if they're older traditional operating systems that are IP enabled, we can look out for those and monitor changes to them, make sure that they're operating properly, make sure there are some anomalies or weird things occurring, or maybe they're creating paths to go to external devices that they shouldn't be. Those type of things we can look at and provide a lot of that data, not only to a SOC team, but also the network architecture team, just to make sure things are working smoothly. And certainly SOC teams and network architecture teams need to work hand in hand, certainly in planning the network, but as you find threats or as you find breach activity, the ability to remediate those type of things becomes critical that both of these teams work together very closely. When you look at segmentation analytics, again, we're looking for changes in network flow paths that we can see, whether it's segmentation or not, to be honest, we can see that either way. But also with segmentation rules in place, you definitely want to note if something's changing there. Being able to see leak paths that are being created to the internet from OT environments or even from my cloud environments for that matter. Be able to see violations around network segmentation where maybe malicious users are trying to get around segmentation policies and find different ways to probe or move laterally throughout the network. And then certainly around misconfigurations. We talked about that at the beginning of the presentation that misconfigurations is actually a major source of trouble for industrial control systems. And again, certainly firewall rule changes can be a big part of that misconfiguration problem. So these are the type of areas that we can definitely look into. In terms of breach detection analytics, again, we can detect certain attack activity, whether it's Tor connections or zombies, zombie nodes being created, or being able to do remote server callbacks to allow attackers to take stronger control over systems internally, or just be able to create communication channels that can be used for nefarious purposes. Being able to identify data paths that are being created to be able to exfiltrate data. Those are the types of things that we can see based on our breach detection, and certainly marry that with the threat intelligence community that's out there that's providing constant updates around seeing new types of attacks that are coming out. So with that, I will, that was an introduction into some of the things that Joe's going to show you in the demo. So let me again quickly turn it over to him.
Thanks, Sanjay.
And I can see your screen. That's good.
Okay, good. Thank you. So I want to just give a brief overview of Lumeta Spectre. I'll touch on the use cases that Sanjay mentioned. I'll start out with breach detection and then go over to the real-time monitoring as well as the real-time segmentation validation. So what we're looking at here is the Lumeta Spectre dashboard. This is the place that once a user logs into Lumeta Spectre, they get dropped in. The dashboards are very, very flexible in that users can move these widgets around, change the data, add, remove whatever widgets they want. The product also comes with a set of canned dashboards around various use cases, be they vulnerability management or endpoint management solutions or dynamic edge. This is where we talk about segmentation violations, for example. And users can create their own. So there's really no limit or no access restrictions in terms of what type of data can be accessed or reported on from within Spectre. So again, what we're looking at here is the breach detection dashboard, and want to talk a little bit about the threat flow and Tor flow use cases. These are the use cases where we are correlating Lumeta Spectre discovery data and visibility data with things like NetFlow and with threat intelligence. On the threat intelligence piece of it, Lumeta Spectre comes bundled with an iDefense key so that threat intelligence from iDefense can be ingested readily from within the product to power some of these use cases. Also, we have partnerships with Gigamon for flow collection or flow ingestion, or we can ingest NetFlow from basically any collector that's available on the network. So again, what we're correlating here is NetFlow source and destination IP addresses. We're bouncing those against the threat intelligence data that we're gathering. We also have other integrations with open source threat intelligence data feeds like emerging threats, for example. And you can see here we have the destination IP address, the source IP address, where that IP address shows up in threat intelligence, who the feed is, what kind of threat it is, and the score, and this is indicated by the threat intelligence feed, what ports they're communicating on, what zone it's in. So you can see very, very quickly I'm able to take a look at what kind of threat flows are happening in my environment, be it IT, OT, or what have you, and basically drill in and get additional details about what that flow is. In a similar manner, correlating Tor relays and Tor X nodes with the NetFlow, we're able to identify devices in the IT or OT environment that are having unauthorized conversations. So again, these are devices that are talking to known bad actors or to Tor nodes. And again, you can see that we show the source and destination IP address, which IP address showed up in the Tor list, what kind of device it is, what kind of relay it is, and the port which the communication is happening on. And from here, I can actually drill in to get additional information. So I can click on this device, click maps, and now I'm able to see where that device is sitting from within my OT environment, since that's the zone that I clicked on. So the map comes up, it expands, and it highlights the device. I can hover over the device and get additional metadata about it in terms of what type of device it is, when it was discovered, things like that. I can actually zoom out a little bit to see how it's connected to the rest of my infrastructure. And this is a real-time map. So you can see there's a bunch of devices here that are blinking in red. These are actually directly correlated to the alerts that you see up in the upper right-hand corner. So I can actually subscribe to various types of notifications and have those show up on the map in real time. So this device happens to have an alert associated with it, and I can click in and get additional information on what that alert is. Moving over to, so this is the real-time monitoring. This is where that would happen. And the map is very, very flexible. I can ungroup everything. I can group everything by device type and get additional kind of intelligence on what's actually comprising my network. From here, let me go over to the dynamic edge use case or dashboard. And this is where we talk about segmentation violations. So you can see we have a couple of widgets here that are associated with either inbound or outbound leak paths. So we're able to tell you whether the leak path is actually an ingress point or an egress point. And we can get additional details very, very quickly about some of these devices. So again, let me go ahead and drill in. into this device, show it off on a map, and take a look at where it is on my network. So there it is. Again, hovering over, I can see that here's the device IP address, MAC address. It happens to be a FreeBSD OS type device. And I can get even additional more details if I right-click and go to device details. Now I have the full log of information about that device. So I could see things like whether or not it's currently active, whether or not SMB accessible, what types of discovery it responded to, and when it was first discovered and when I last observed it. So this is the last time I had a conversation with it. In terms of the profiling, I can tell that it's a Dell machine, it's running FreeBSD, and we actually show you the patterns that we've matched on as we interrogated that device to try to figure out what it is. We can do port interrogation, so we can tell you what ports we interrogated that showed an open response versus closed response. And on the leak response, we show you, which protocols are responsible for that leak path and the direction of it, whether it's inbound or outbound. And then finally, I think one of the coolest things here is we do provide you with notifications associated with that device. So everything from when it was first discovered all the way through profiling, and if anything is changing about that device, we're able to show it. So you can see that at 1516, this device was inactive, and then a few minutes later became active. That may or may not be an important finding, but at least you're notified about it, and you can actually go back and look into some of these notifications in the event that there's a forensic investigation or something along those lines that needs to happen. And then speaking of notifications, I just want to spend a moment and show you just how tailorable those are. So clicking on the notifications button under systems, you can see the list of available notifications from within the product. And these are actually broken up by zone and users. So zones, users can subscribe to different notification types from within each zone. So you can see in my OT network, I have a device discovered as an alert level priority. So, means sound the alarms if something happens here or if a new device joins this network. Whereas in my IT environment, it may be okay for other devices to join because I have a BYOD policy and it's a little bit more dynamic. So maybe I just want an informational alert about devices joining that particular part of the network. Finally, the last thing I want to show is around integrations. Just want to show off a quick list of all of the available integrations from Lumeta Spectre. So I mentioned some of the fees that are available that are open source, be they emerging threats or the Tor list or the ISC port list. This is the list of ports associated with malware. We also support subscription fees from emerging threats as well as iDefense, although iDefense does get bundled in from within the product. And then interfacing with best-of-breed third-party solutions, be they Gigamon for Flow or Carbon Black and McAfee for endpoint, Infoblox for IPAM, Cisco, Qualys for vulnerability management, obviously. So we try to make our data as accessible as possible for other solutions, and we work very closely with our customers and prospects in terms of identifying other high-value integrations that they'd be interested in, that those solutions can get value from the data that Lumeta Spectre is collecting, and make that as digestible as possible for those other solutions. So with that, let me turn it back to Sanjay.
Okay, everyone, I think we are all set for today. We're wrapped up. Thank you, Joe, for giving us that great demo, and I hope everyone really enjoyed the webinar today and got some value out of the information we provided. If you have any questions, feel free to contact us at Lumeta, and you can use info@lumeta.com to get more information about Lumeta or Lumeta Spectre. Again, hope everyone enjoyed the webinar today. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Bye-bye.